Hello, you're watching Scotland at 7, and it's Thursday, the 17th of February. I'm Hugh Stewart in the Glasgow studio, and joining me tonight to discuss today's news is Member of Parliament for Gordon, Richard Thomson. Good evening, Richard. Thank you for joining us. So, can you hear me loud and clear? So, I think Richard's sound has just gone off just now. So, okay. Yes, hello, Richard. We just had a glitch there. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
That's smashing.
That's come
Okay.
through loud and clear now.
Right, that's great. So, Richard, you're the MP for Gordon. That includes Ellen, Inverurie, Huntly, those wee towns in the northeast, I
All
believe.
sorts of wonderful places in between as well.
Aye, it's a smashing part of the country. So I'm going to just go straight through our top story and then we'll discuss them with you as we go along, Richard. So the first story tonight, we're back to the crisis in Ukraine. Tensions in the east of Ukraine have risen after Russian-backed militias opened fire across the line of control with Ukrainian forces, hitting a nursery school and injuring 3 people. According to the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that's the OSCE, there were multiple shelling incidents on Thursday morning across the front line in the Donbass region. The attack on Stanitsia Luhanska blew a hole through the wall of a kindergarten. Classes had begun when the building was reportedly hit by a shell, with debris strewn over a play area. Pupils were, however, in another room when the missile hit, but 3 staff were reportedly left with concussion. The Ukrainian military said that 32 shells landed on the city, also injuring a serviceman and disrupting electricity supplies. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky accused the Russian side of provocative shelling. NATO's Jens Stoltenberg said that he was concerned that Russia is trying to stage a pretext for an armed attack against Ukraine. The OSCE logs regular firing between Moscow armed militias and Ukrainian soldiers. Recently, this low-level conflict has been relatively calm as Russia moved 150,000 troops to Ukraine's borders. Ukrainian soldiers have been under instruction not to return fire. Russia has accused Kiev of trying to provoke an escalation to recapture rebel territory by force. It says Ukraine is guilty of genocide, which Ukraine strongly denies. The Kremlin said on Thursday it was deeply concerned by the flare-up of violence and hoped that the West would use its influence on Kiev to prevent further escalation. The US, UK and Stoltenberg don't believe that Russia is pulling its forces out. The Kremlin said time was needed for troops to return to their bases. US President Biden said every indication that the US has shows that Russia is prepared to go into Ukraine. The president's comments come after the Russian government expelled US Deputy Chief of Mission Bartel Gorman from the country and made further demands that the US roll back troop deployments and assistance to Kiev as a precondition for ending the crisis. A State Department spokesman told The Independent Mr. Gorman's expulsion was unprovoked. Well, Richard, that's the latest in the continuing crisis in Ukraine. First of all, does this look like evidence of what we call false flag operations? That means an event happens and we're not entirely sure which side provoked it, and is this part of the Russian attempt to really confuse and maybe try and pass the blame over to the other side?
Well, I'm not sure about false flag, but I think it's certainly an unwelcome development. And I think that, as is sometimes said in war, the first casualty is truth. And I don't think it necessarily needs the powers of invention of the Russian state for them to come up with some sort of muddied waters which would provide them with the pretext. And I think it's an interesting tactic that has been adopted in response to that, whereby inconsistencies between what the Russian government has been saying and what has actually been happening on the ground has been called out. Only need to go back to yesterday when there was an announcement or a suggestion that there was a withdrawal of some of the 150,000 Russian troops away from the border. And yet what we appear to have seen is far from a withdrawal from positions close to the border is in fact an intensification of the militarisation around there. So I think the situation remains very, very concerning. there, and I think nobody wants to see any kind of conflict. My own personal concern about this, and I don't claim to be a military expert, but 150,000 troops is an awful lot of soldiers. But it's while it might be enough for an invasion, if that is what is indeed being planned or contemplated at the moment by the Kremlin, it doesn't seem like much for a force to occupy more than perhaps some of the eastern parts of Ukraine. And I think that in this there is a strategic danger for Vladimir Putin, that if this is being perpetrated because of a fear of a loss of influence, it will almost certainly guarantee a complete loss of influence in Eastern Europe. What it has done is it has woken NATO allies up about the dangers to their own security. It's leading to a strengthening of NATO's flanks. It is re-alerting Western capitals to the need to have a robust defence posture, and reminding people of the importance of the NATO allies. And for this to, and the NATO alliance, and all of this, it seems to be a losing situation for Vladimir Putin. If he wanted to get people's attention, he's got that. I think that the opportunity is now to try and pivot to what it is that he really wants, but I think he is in grave danger of losing any kind of influence he might have had, even over some of the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine. He seems to be doing a lot to ferment a single Ukrainian opposition to his manoeuvres, and I think that it's more driven by a kind of weakness. If this is a way of winning hearts and minds, it doesn't seem to be one which seems like it will stand much long-term success. But as I say, we kind of watch and wait at the moment and hope that whatever diplomacy can do in terms of security guarantees, not just for Russia, of course, but for Ukraine as well, can come to the fore. But to stake all of this on something like Ukraine abandoning its long-term desire to join NATO. Well, it's an unreasonable demand, because countries should fundamentally be able to form their own alliances, and NATO should be allowed to extend membership to whomsoever it wishes. But with that said, I don't think there's anybody, not even in the Ukraine, sees Ukrainian membership of NATO as a long-term prospect, or even perhaps a realistic prospect. So the question has to be, what is it that can be taken out of this situation which can build long-term security guarantees, not just for Russia, but also for NATO, but above all Ukraine, so that we can return to the state of peace that we've perhaps taken too lightly for granted over the last few decades.
Yes, so you're in fact saying, although one of Russia's key demands is that NATO should pull back from those frontier states, Poland and Ukraine, of course, but in fact that's the last thing that's going to happen because of the Russian escalation. So Putin's tactics might well prove self-defeating.
And absolutely it shouldn't happen, because fundamentally, if you believe in the sovereign independence of countries, they have the sovereign independence to form alliances with other countries as they wish. And it's not the place of anyone sitting in the Kremlin, or anywhere else for that matter, to try and dictate to countries where their security alliances should lie. The best interests for everyone is for there not to be conflict, but fundamentally, if countries were not feeling threatened, they would maybe feel less need for there to be security alliances of the kind that we've seen over the last century.
Yep, so defusing, the long-term aim on both sides is to defuse the conflict, but there's maybe not much sign in that. Just lastly, before we move on, as you represent the Westminster constituency, is there generally agreement in the Westminster parties with the general approach that the UK and NATO are taking?
I think there's mainstream acceptance of that in the leadership and the broad rank and file of those parties. Obviously, there will be strong voices against that elsewhere, but generally speaking, I'm quite wary when political leaderships of parties tend to be in agreement, because politics works best when there's opposition and ideas are subject to scrutiny. But I think there is a realisation that what is going on here is not in the interests of European security, and it's not Ukraine in any of its actions, or NATO in any of its actions, that is putting European security at threat here.
Aye. Yep. Right, thanks, Richard. So let's move on to our second story today. We hear from London that 3 police officers who worked with Sarah Everard's killer, Wayne Couzens, have been charged over allegations they shared racist and misogynist messages. 2 serving Metropolitan Police officers and 1 former officer have been charged with sending grossly offensive messages on WhatsApp, the Crown Prosecution Office said. That's a CPS. The 3 are due to appear at Westminster Magistrates Court on the 16th of March. The CPS said it would not confirm the names of the officers for operational reasons. Rosemary Ainsley, the head of the CPS Special Crime Division, said the service had authorised charges against the officers following evidence from the IOPC, that's the Police Complaints Committee. Each of the 3 defendants has been charged with sending grossly offensive messages on a public communications network, WhatsApp, she said. So, Richard, is this an evidence of the kind of culture change which the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has been demanding that the Met shows some leadership on?
Well, it's certainly evidence of the need for a culture change. Look, fundamentally, we expect the police to behave with the utmost probity at all times, on duty and off. And we expect them to uphold the law without fear and without favour, and to be blind and provide the same level of service to everyone who needs their help and support. And it is absolutely chilling to learn of some of the locker room banter, as they might describe it, that's been going on, but the totally unacceptable nature of the messages that have been going around in terms of the racist content, the homophobic content, the misogynistic content. And I think for a police force which has historically had problems in terms of how it's been seen to deal with many ethnic minorities in London, and for this to still be happening in this day and age is absolutely frightful. And so we can't, I think, any longer rely on the defence that it is locker room banter. It's not banter at all. It breaches, you would imagine, it's clearly been thought that this might breach a criminal threshold, which is why a prosecution has been brought. But we have the right to believe and to have people serving in the role of police constables and at all ranks of the police service who are upholding their duty to the law and to the people without fear and without favour, and certainly without any prejudice to the groups that they are there to protect. And people have a right to feel safe, and to know that there are people who are putting on that badge in the morning and going out and using language like this with their colleagues, to know that might actually be their private thoughts, or that might be impeding the way that they carry out their duties, is simply horrifying. So this is a culture that needs to be cleared out. It needs to be cleared out at all levels. It requires the force to show leadership. It requires the political direction in terms of how the force is scrutinised. But above all, it requires that organisational root and branch reform and clear out in the culture, so that routinely, wherever this occurs, it is reported, it's called out, and ultimately it's stamped out. Because, as I say, everybody who lives, whether they live in London or anywhere else, who's subject to the lawful authority of a police force, deserves to be able to feel and have evidence that they are carrying out their duties properly and in a manner which is utterly beyond reproach in terms of how they approach all who rely upon them for their safety.
Yes, there's huge demands on a service like the Met Police, serving a massive city with such a diversity of cultures within it. The police have to go the extra mile, don't they, to make sure that they reflect that culture. So Sadiq Khan, of course, has made it clear, the Mayor of London, and he, in fact, was really largely responsible for the resignation of Cressida Dick, because he withdrew his support. So he's made it clear that he wants to be involved in choosing somebody who can show leadership. Has he been getting his retaliation in first? Because Home Secretary Patel hasn't actually nominated anyone, but is he just saying, when you do, I want to make sure that we've had a good look at them and that they will provide that leadership?
I have to confess, I'm not entirely certain what the governance process is in terms of appointing a new Metropolitan Police Commissioner. I think it is the Home Secretary's decision, but ultimately, since the Mayor of London, as I understand it, effectively carries out the role of the Police and Crime Commissioners, which is an innovation that they have in England, and
Aye.
may we never go that route in Scotland, for heaven's sake. It's far, far better. We've got far, far better scrutiny and accountability, I think, both at national senior level and at local level in Scotland now. Certainly than they have in police forces across anywhere in England, and I think certainly than we had under the old legacy regional forces. But given that Sadiq Khan is effectively fulfilling the role of that police and crime commissioner, I think it would be a foolish Home Secretary who went ahead on an appointment without at least taking the views of the Mayor of London, who will ultimately be the politician working most closely on a day-to-day basis with that police commissioner. Of course, just because it would be foolish not to do that doesn't mean that somebody like Priti Patel won't go ahead and do it anyway. I had a little chuckle to myself when she described Sadiq Khan as being impolite and unprofessional, I think were the words, or words to that effect, that she used. And I think I would struggle to find a more appropriate couple of adjectives to describe her, frankly, in much of her dealings. But no, she, even if she ultimately has the power of appointment, Sadiq Khan will be working with a commissioner and their team on a day-to-day basis on community policing in London, and that's a liaison that should take place sooner rather than later in the appointment process, in my view.
But certainly the person who gets the job has the task of really transforming the culture of a massive organisation. So clearly it requires leadership, whoever the person
absolutely,
is.
Hugh. But the other thing about it is that there are so many good police officers in the force and who do not deserve to be tarnished by the behaviour of those whose actions are coming to light. And the sooner somebody can get in there and take the force by the scruff of the neck and make some progress with the cultural change that very, very self-evidently needs to happen, the better for everyone.
Yep. Okay, thank you, Richard. Let's move on again now to a different story on the economy. New Office of National Statistics, that's the ONS, numbers point to the worsening cost of living in UK. The number of adults seeing an increase in their cost of living has risen from 69% of adults in January to 76% more recently in a survey gathered from the 3rd to the 13th of February. Those surveyed noticed big rises in shop food prices, in energy and in their fuel bills. Separate studies have showed that overall retail prices rose for the 5th week in a row by additional 2%, while real pay fell by 0.8%. Commenting, the SNP Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewlis MP said, "The Tory-made cost of living crisis is hammering families up and down the country. We are hearing more and more families who are having to decide between heating their homes and putting food on the table." This, she said, falls squarely at the Chancellor's feet. And Ms Thewlis continued, "Instead of burying their heads in the sand, the Tories must make the £200 energy loan into a grant. They need to reverse the callous cut to universal credit and introduce a real living wage. As long as the Chancellor refuses to act, he and this Westminster government will continue to make the case for independence stronger." And Ms Thewlis continued by saying that only an independent Scotland would have the powers needed to eradicate poverty. So I'm not going to ask you if you agree with Alison Thewlis on that last point, Richard. But what I was going to ask you about is the governing party, which has been apparently concerned about Boris Johnson's leadership. Have you heard anyone saying that maybe we've got it wrong on the economy? Maybe it's about time we gave people a break?
No, frankly. There's been a couple of debates recently on the cost of living at Westminster. The SNP used one of our Opposition Day debates recently to talk about that, and Labour did the same a couple of weeks later. And there was a steady procession of Tory backbenchers took to their hind legs and wrung their hands about the cost of living and everything, but predictably it all kind of they were less clear about what it was that they were going to do. And I think that the charge that the Labour Party has been levying is beginning to stick home, that they're a low growth the Conservatives are a low growth high tax party, and I think they'll be taking some schadenfreude in that, because that's usually the jibe that the Conservatives throw at Labour. But no, I mean, I think there are some Conservatives are starting to understand that this is hurting. It's hurting their constituents. But in terms of prescriptions about how to solve it, they are coming up pretty short. And I think Alison hit the nail on the head there. Scrap the universal credit uplift withdrawal that's taken place. I mean, we're seeing energy bills going up by an average of £1,000 a year at the same time as folk in universal credit have just had their benefits cut by £1,000 a year. So that's a swing of £2,000 potentially in some family incomes there. The converting loans to grants, I think that's a very useful thing to do. I don't think that giving people loans that they don't want on their energy bills is a good thing to do. So converting that to a grant is a good thing to do. The best way out of poverty, where I do agree with the Tories, is for people who are able to work to be in work and well-paid work, so paying a real living wage. What the UK government does is it matches the living wage figure usually about 2 to 3 weeks before another one is issued for the year ahead. So they're in alignment for about 2 to 3 weeks and out of line for the next 49 weeks. So actually making sure people are paid a decent wage to begin with would help enormously. Another thing they could do is to stick to their manifesto pledge and scrap the planned increase in national insurance, a regressive tax that hits the lowest earners and the youngest and disproportionately hard. If you want to put up taxes on income, then put it on income tax and, stick it on folk higher earners like MPs, dare I say it, who are in a better position to help shoulder that burden. But I think the elephant in the room in all of this is Brexit. We're all aware that inflation is rising right across Europe, across the world. It's been driven in part by high energy crises. It's been driven in part by contractions in supply chains and frictions caused by COVID. But the one thing that is affecting the United Kingdom that isn't affecting anywhere else is Brexit and coming out of the single market and the customs union. And because of that, we're seeing the costs of transporting goods increasing. We're seeing a shortage of lorry drivers. We're seeing shortages of labour in key sectors. That's driven food prices up even higher. It's driven up other prices. So for all that commodity prices are high and energy prices are high, we've just made things an awful lot worse because of Brexit. And, the only way we solve Brexit, the only way we solve the misfiring tax and benefit system and making sure that we can place the responsibility for shouldering the burden on those who are best able to shoulder it is, as Alison says, independence.
Yes, and as we reported yesterday, Labour seems to have turned its back on, Labour's actually said we're not going to reverse Brexit, so they don't seem to be looking for any votes in Scotland any longer. I'd love to discuss that more, but we better move on, Richard, looking at the clock. And the next important story we hear today is that the UK Cabinet is split over the government's living with COVID strategy, with Sajid Javid expected to push for retaining some free testing and community surveillance of the virus in the face of a Treasury demand to slash the budget. The UK strategy is going to be announced next week, the strategy of living with COVID, that is. But early reports have suggested that the UK Treasury is seeking to cut the budget for the remaining COVID provisions by up to 90%. That is from £15 billion this year to as little as £1.3 billion in future years. The plans could end all free PCR testing from March, except for the most vulnerable, as well as hospitals in high-risk settings, and an end to the free asymptomatic testing with the lateral flow tests, that's the LFTs. However, there is a debate over the level of funding for free LFTs for those who do have COVID symptoms. White House sources say that Sajid Javid's Department for Health and Social Care is expected to argue for more money to ensure the survival of the pandemic antiviral drugs trial, which officials believe would need free LFTs for over 50s and vulnerable adults under 50 to continue at least till September. The Health Secretary is also expected to argue for a scaled-back version of the ONS infection survey, which could lose all or part of its funding. The infection survey shows the prevalence of COVID and is considered a world gold standard. Responding to the reports of the end to free LFTs, SNP's health spokesman Martin Day said, "We know that free testing is effective in addressing the virus and should remain in place for as long as public health experts recommend. If one part of the UK chooses to end it, then the UK government must honour its commitment to ensuring it remains funded in those parts of the UK who are continuing to follow public health guidance. So on COVID, does it look as if they think it's all over?
Well, I think it does. And I think they're absolutely wrong. In fact, I'll go further. This is just the most stupid, imbecilic response imaginable. And, it's almost got shades of George W. Bush declaring victory in the Iraq war, while war in Iraq raged on for years afterwards. And it's almost like Boris Johnson is so desperate to distract people's attention from parties and the circumstances in which are held that he's prepared to say anything and prepared to risk anything when it comes to COVID to try and distract people with the illusion of the freedom that comes. Look, I get really, really annoyed when people say, particularly Tories, we've got to learn to live with the virus. I mean, what in God's name do they think we've been doing for the last 2 years, apart from living with it as best we can? When we had no method to tackle it other than distancing, we had the lockdown. When the infection levels came down, we returned to some kind of normality gradually. We wore masks. Eventually, viable vaccinations came through. So we had the mass vaccination program, and that's had a big effect in terms of suppressing the infection and improving people's chances of surviving it and minimising the chances of passing it on to others. And it's only because of that effort that we're in the position we're in now. But one of the key tools that we have, if we want to open up further, has been regular testing on the lateral flow tests. I mean, that's been an absolute godsend in terms of allowing people to go about their business with confidence, and more importantly, because it's so widespread, for individuals to have confidence in the way that other people were behaving in terms of them behaving responsibly as well. It's all part of that social construct that we can't deal with this as individuals. We need to have a broadly collective response to that. Now, if you take away that testing and force people to pay for it, we've just been talking about a cost of living crisis. If you're going to have to pay 5, 10, 15, 20 pounds, whatever it will cost a week for tests, then the injunction to flow before you go is going to start falling on perhaps willing but increasingly deaf ears, because there will be people who cannot afford that, or who decide they'll just say, sod this, I'm not paying it. And therefore, you're going to have a great deal more potentially asymptomatic people who are carrying the virus going out and spreading it. Eventually, you're going to see increased levels of infection. And with that, you're going to see a loss of confidence in the public space that could be catastrophic. You're going to see people retreating back and effectively imposing restrictions on themselves, even if they're not legally mandated to do that, while infection rates go through the roof and we end up with more pressures on the NHS. So having that free supply of LFT tests is absolutely imperative, because inevitably it will be those who can least afford it who will be the ones who withdraw from that reluctantly or otherwise. And that is just going to endanger us all. So really, the UK government really needs to rethink this. And if they are determined to press ahead with that in England, then they need to make sure that the funding remains in place for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, Irish jurisdictions to continue with it for so long as the public health advice
supports that. The other three health
that.
authorities are definitely at the moment continuing with free testing, so we need to have the funding available to secure that. Yeah, thanks, Richard. Now, I'll just quickly go over the next story, which we just received a couple of hours ago. I don't think we need any comment, unless you've got anything you want to jump in on, because we're talking about the storms, and a statement from John Swinney tonight. With severe weather set to continue into the weekend, the Scottish Government is urging people to continue to exercise caution and to follow the latest travel advice. Deputy First Minister John Swinney was due to chair a further meeting of the Scottish Government's Resilience Room on Thursday evening, that's about now, as the coordination of the response to Storms Dudley and Eunice continues. All warnings for Storm Dudley have now been lifted, but a yellow warning remains for Storm Eunice into the early hours of Friday. And John Swinney said, with two storms back to back, we expect severe weather to continue into the weekend across large parts of the country. We would strongly urge everyone to continue to pay close attention to the latest travel advice and to exercise caution on the roads. Storm Eunice may bring heavy snow and strong winds to much of Scotland from the early hours of Friday, posing further risks to transport and other essential services. The Scottish Government's Resilience Committee will continue to monitor the situation. We remain in close contact with local authorities and emergency services and essential services to ensure people in the affected areas receive the latest information, advice and support where needed. So unless you've got anything to say on that, Richard, I'll move on to the next story. So, we're now going to look at the UK's planned scrapping the golden visa scheme. Now, this is a story today that UK ministers are preparing to scrap the golden visa system, which allows wealthy foreign investors a fast track to living in the UK amid concerns over links with Russia. Given concerns about how the system is being misused and considering souring of relations with Moscow over the Ukraine crisis, Home Secretary Priti Patel is to axe the residence route. Launched in 2008, the scheme allows people with at least £2 million in investment funds and a UK bank account to apply for a Tier 1 investor visa. The UK government sources suggested that Patel would get rid of the pathway to residency next week amid concerns that insufficient background checks are being made on applicants. Armed Forces Minister James Heapley told BBC's Radio 4 Today programme this morning that changes were made to RAT in 2015 and 2019 to make sure that the checks were ever more stringent. But absolutely, as we enter into what could be a generation or longer of quite acute competition with Russia, all of the things that have become normal in Anglo-Russian relations over the last 30 years will be up for review. At least 700 of these visas have been issued to Russian millionaires in the first 8 years of the scheme, according to the Times. So, Richard, I'm putting this in the context of the paper, the piece that Nicola Sturgeon published in The Guardian last week, saying that there has to be a serious look at Russian money, Russian dodgy money. So the Armed Forces Minister is saying we have to seriously reset our relations with Russia. Are the Tories ready to say goodbye to Russian money?
Well, time will tell on that, and they've got an intravenous drip that they seem to be hooked up to. I mean, Boris Johnson has certainly been certainly lured in more than his fair share of donations to the Conservative Party through that. There's a lady who's particularly of particular interest, Lyubov Chernyukin, the wife of Vladimir Putin's former finance minister. I believe I'm right in saying she paid a substantial sum to play tennis with Boris Johnson. We know that she certainly paid £20,000 to have lunch with Ruth Davidson. Now, it's unclear whether or not the lunch ever took place, but for quite some time, and she's not the only one, for quite some time, the Conservatives have been quite happy to open their bank account to donations from very, very dubious sources indeed. And if we're going to clean up politics, then you need to ban foreign donations. You need to have absolute transparency about where that funding's coming from. You should stop having effectively unregulated third-party donees like the lunch clubs and the business councils. And, we need to have openness and transparency, particularly around donations in Northern Irish politics as well. I make no bones about saying that, because there was money came through Northern Ireland to influence the Brexit campaign. So there's all sorts of things that we need to do to protect our democracy in terms of safeguarding against donations which aren't always purely motivated, shall we say. But in terms of these golden visas, they should never have been offered in the first place. Either somebody meets the criteria for acceptance and the right to make a life in this jurisdiction, or they don't. And just simply because you arrive with lots of money shouldn't mean that you get a golden visa and a red carpet rolled out for you. We should be looking at the content of people's characters and the contribution that they will that they will make, and not simply the size of their bank balance. And I think it has it has simply burnished London's unenviable reputation as the laundromat for the world's dirty money, and as a laundromat for the dirty reputations of many around the world. Nobody should be getting here under any kind of preferential treatment whatsoever. And it's long past time that this shameful practice was brought to a close. But whether or not the Tories can ever wean themselves off the teat of dodgy donations, time will tell. We already see what they do with cash for honours. We saw what the Labour Party did with cash for honours. You shouldn't let the Liberal Democrats off the hook either. They've been just as guilty in their own way in the past as well. But there's a thorough root and branch reform needs to happen to protect democracy, to root out crime, and it starts with following the money and shutting off the sources of dubious money that come into this country, and by not giving anybody a free pass, whether that's into the legislature or whether it's simply in terms of their right to set up home here.
Yes, the Tories do seem to be very Russian friendly. So, well, as you say, Richard, we'll see what happens. So it looks like cash for visas is maybe going to end, but we'll see if that happens in next week's news. Okay, our next story, we're going to continue with the story which we discussed a couple of days ago about the Scottish Fire and Rescue being able to now offer a nasal spray which could save lives in a case of drug overdose. Now today, Chief Constable of Police Scotland, Ian Livingston, has decided that all operational officers in Police Scotland will be trained and equipped with a life-saving nasal spray which can be given safely to people who have suffered a drug overdose. A national rollout of naloxone follows a successful test in Dundee, Falkirk, Glasgow, Stirling and Caithness, during which officers used the spray which counters the effect of an overdose from opioids such as heroin to provide first aid, and have used it on 62 occasions. Chief Constable Livingston said, "I know the terrible toll of drug deaths in Scotland, and policing is committed to playing our part in reducing the harm caused to individuals, families and communities. We have a vital role in bringing those engaged in serious and organised crime to justice, and that will always be a key duty and priority for Police Scotland. Preserving of life, keeping people safe lies right at the heart of policing, and we have a purpose and remit which goes beyond law enforcement. We have a positive legal duty to improve the lives of our communities. Equipping and training officers with naloxone will continue to that mission. Policing is so often the first and last resort, the service first on the scene and the service which responds to crisis and criticality. Where a person is suffering an overdose, naloxone nasal spray can be given safely by officers with no adverse effects." And the Chief Constable added, "I'm grateful to all the officers who stepped forward during the trial to carry naloxone and to help their fellow citizens when they needed it. During the test, 808 officers were trained to use naloxone, and now 656, that's 81% of them, have volunteered to carry the nasal spray kits." And finally, the number of drugs-related deaths in Scotland had risen constantly in recent years to a total of 1,339 in 2020. So first of all, Richard, I guess you're going to welcome the extension of naloxone from Fire and Rescue, where people can volunteer to carry it to Police Scotland. So obviously this is part of the serious strategy now to get rid of to bring down that drugs death total. But I'm going to ask you about the kind of balance in what the Chief Constable has said. So he's trying to stress two things, isn't he? He's saying, first of all, we are community. We're involved in the community, and what do people need? We are there to help. We are the first responders. But he's also not forgetting the criminality side of it, isn't he? Is he trying to balance the two sides, that we're down on drugs, but we're also trying to help people who've been affected by drugs?
Oh, yeah. I mean, clearly the police have a responsibility to enforce the law proportionately and as effectively as they can. But in a situation where somebody is overdosing on heroin, I think any police officer worthy of the name, the very last thing on their mind is thinking about a prosecution of the individual whose life is at threat, or any other criminality at that point. It's about saving life. And in those situations, the instinct and the responsibility should be to preserve life above all else. And if naloxone has been proven to be able to do that, then it can help reduce the instances of accidental drug overdoses in those situations, and hopefully bring people back from the brink and give them another chance. So from that extent, in terms of how it can help to save lives and reduce Scotland's drug death toll obviously it's a very, very welcome addition, but it doesn't distract from the need to be able to tackle the drugs problems. And I deliberately use a plural there that Scotland has, because it's not just an injecting drugs problem, there's a recreational drugs problem. And I think the direction the Scottish Government has been trying to go in with this has been the right one, in that not every drugs problem is, although it may involve controlled or illegal substances, the best approach in every case is not always the criminal one. And certainly when it comes to individual users, it's far, far better and far more effective in the long term, both for that individual's personal outcomes, but also for society in general, if we, instead of going down the criminal justice route, that wherever appropriate, we go down a public health route instead. And I think this is part of that, about harm reduction. It's another tool in the armoury for harm reduction, and on that basis, I think it's very much to be welcomed. But it is not the solution, and I don't think anyone would realistically claim that it is. But it is part of a broader response that needs to be brought to bear, and which can hopefully lead to more often being able to treat drugs as the public health problem that it is, rather than using the often too blunt instrument of a criminal justice system, which has, which, however robustly enforced, hasn't made much of an impact on Scotland's relationship with drugs over the decades, sadly.
Yes, that's right. So, of course, there is that general direction of travel in the Scottish Government to move towards health rather than criminal justice solutions to the drugs problem. Now, our next problem we're going to discuss is social media misinformation. Now, new research today has suggested that social media bots, that is to say robotic, automatic, well, maybe you can explain more what it is later on, Richard. I'll just move on. The social media bots pose less of a threat, spreading harmful messages and misinformation than previously thought, research suggests. Messages posted by bots on divisive issues such as Brexit, immigration, or climate change have far less impact on users' views than those from famous people and influencers, researchers say. The findings show that Twitter posts shared by people with more than 10,000 followers have the greatest influence on the opinions of other users. Previous research has shown that social media bots, those are automatic accounts designed to mimic human behaviour, are involved in spreading misinformation and harmful content. Few studies, however, have explored if posts shared by bots have any real impact on users' perspectives. The new study by the University of Edinburgh analysed how bots affect users' views on 7 contentious topics. Data from more than 4,000 Twitter users expressing views on each topic was then used to study direct and indirect interactions with more than 19 million other accounts, including bots. The effect bots have on behaviours that shape users' views, such as likes, retweets or comments on posts, was compared with other account types such as held by influencers and famous people. Bots were found to have very limited relation to users' stance on different topics. On average, they made up less than 10% of the accounts that had a direct or indirect impact on users' opinions. By contrast, people with 10,000 plus followers on average made up more than half of accounts affecting users' views. This rose to more than 70% when people's views were shaped by exposure to negative messages on topics by influencers on social media. I've tried to explain what a bot was there, but I failed. So we're talking about robotized. Well, could you explain what a bot is? If you get any more understanding of it?
Well, I'll tell you what my understanding is, Hugh. Basically, it's an automated account on social media that will post things, and usually it will try and disguise its identity. It'll be basically it's a third-party operator or even just a computer posing as a real individual, and it will post a certain amount of innocuous material in order to build up followers, and then it will post the message that the operator really wants it to try and propagate, whether that's anti-vax material or pro-Brexit material, or just to take 2 notorious examples at random there. And the idea is that real Twitter or sort of Facebook users, real social media users will not spot that it's an account that isn't run by a genuine person and will accept it at face value. But they're also often liking posts and sharing posts to disseminate and sharing the posts of other bots in order to try and create the impression of a crowd being of similar mind, because we know that the human psyche is driven by the instinct sometimes of the herd. So it's a bit like a small number of people running around, or computers in this case, running around trying to look like a crowd. And it's tangential to what's sometimes called astroturfing, which is to try and create the impression of a grassroots campaign, which is entirely artificially manipulated and doesn't actually represent a wide body of people at all. So I'm quite interested in this, but what I'm more interested in is the study doesn't seem to be able to dismiss the idea that bots can have an impact in terms of propagating a message to get things trending and give ideas and misinformation a credibility that it might not otherwise have. But certainly, I think the things that cause the greatest chagrin are, as the study says, people who have achieved some degree of fame or notoriety, who are real people, who then go shooting their gob off about something or other, and then manage to influence a lot of people or cause a bit of a storm. I mean, we're all aware, we're all aware of certain famous individuals who've done that. There was a footballer yesterday started shooting his gob off about COVID vaccinations for children, and he got roundly criticised for his trouble, and yeah, thoroughly deserved it as well. But you get other people who have achieved some degree of fame who say something that is absolutely bonkers or completely false, and but because they have a large number of followers, there may be people who end up being influenced by that. And I think it comes down as well that we're not very good at, we're not very good as a species at filtering out false information. We seem to be hardwired in our brain to believe rumours, to believe other people that we believe to be credible because they're successful in some field or because we know them personally. Mm-hmm. We're not nearly as good as we ought to be at screening out obvious falsehoods. And I think ultimately you can get the social media companies to crack down on these bots and bad actors and to shut down accounts that are spreading things that are obviously both untrue and harmful. But fundamentally, the best inoculation that you can ever have against false rumours and fake news and deliberate disinformation on the internet is for people to be wise to it and to understand what the credible sources are and how to triangulate from sources and not simply accept that balance is one side being played against another. And it is to spot to be able to navigate their way towards what is truthful by being able to screen out that which is obviously false. And I think that's a very important intellectual toolkit that we need to be doing more to give to our young people in particular, but also the older population as well, who are far from immune from this kind of nonsense, whether it appears sometimes in newspapers or whether it's on social media.
Yes, so in fact, we can be influenced by social media. So the report does seem to be saying that somebody well known, or somebody like maybe Novak Djokovic, who was all over the papers at the start of the week, I suppose that's the kind of influencer that they're talking about. So as you say, it's a good idea to look at two sides of the story. Say to people, maybe that person doesn't really know it all. But we can't shut down people just because they're well known. Sure. But so there's always a freedom of speech side to it as well, isn't there?
Absolutely, and people have a right to be wrong. People have a right to their own opinion, but what people don't have a right to is to invent their own facts. And as I say, it's very, very difficult on the grounds of freedom of speech to shut people down. The best way to clear the public marketplace of ideas of falsehoods is to contest those ideas very often. That's where it becomes tricky with bots, because you simply amplify them by doing that. But I think the best inoculation to falsehood in the public discourse is for people to be able to become better at recognising it. Simple things like checking the dates, checking the web address that it's come from, checking the source, checking how many other credible sources are saying that. And by not always looking for the contrarian point of view that gives you something different or that you think is edgy to say about that. As we often find, going back to, our item at the top of the show about Russia and Ukraine, go and find out what the credible sources of news are saying. They're not all, and don't just dismiss things as, the mainstream media. Often the mainstream media is in the mainstream because by and large, whatever its flaws, it's well resourced and it gets it right.
Yep, of course, and we try to do it ourselves. Incidentally, I'll just mention that a couple of programs I watch on other news channels often equip you with the idea of checking it. That's a point you've just raised there, Richard. You've reminded me that if somebody passes on a picture of an event that was supposed to have happened last week, for example, somebody was talking about the protest, the anti-vax protest converging in Paris, and somebody showed a picture that was supposed to be French police attacking the protesters, but it was clearly summertime when you looked at the trees, so it clearly didn't happen last week. So there are ways that people can actually, do their own checking, their own fact checking, if you like. However, I better move on now. We've got one more story to discuss tonight, then we'll wind it up. Now, from America, we hear that the US House of Representatives Select Committee investigating the Capitol attack is considering issuing a subpoena, that's a citation, to Ivanka Trump to force her cooperation with the inquiry into Donald Trump's efforts to return himself to power on January the 6th. That was just after he lost the election, according to reports in The Guardian. Any move to subpoena Ivanka Trump and, for the first time, to force a member of Trump's own family to testify against him would mark a dramatic escalation in the 6th of January inquiry, which could be serious for the former president. The panel would also have to formally vote on such a measure, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi would have to be informed of the decision before formally authorising a subpoena to the former president's daughter. But members of the Select Committee are reportedly not confident that Ivanka Trump would appear on her own volition. The discussion about the subpoena reflected how important they consider her insight into whether Trump oversaw a criminal conspiracy on the 6th of January 21. Okay, so this would be, of course, an attempt to get real inside information on what was Donald Trump trying to do. We all saw him on the telly, clearly inciting the crowd and telling them to march on the Capitol. Then he withdrew, and we saw him again watching it on the big screen. So clearly he incited it. We knew he was there, but it would be really fascinating, wouldn't it, to know what discussions he was having inside the family of how far did they want the crowd to go that way that day. But is she going to turn up, and she'll just take the Fifth Amendment, won't she? If she is subpoenaed, she'll just say, under my rights under the Fifth Amendment, I'm not going to say anything.
Well, that might be the case, but I think that would also speak volumes because I think that for all the criminal justice law in England has changed, that you no longer have the right. You used to have the right to remain silent without any inference being drawn from that. I think very clearly any silence or pleading of the Fifth Amendment would allow people to draw some very clear inferences from that silence, even if it didn't lead to, even if it wasn't legally actionable in any sense, those conclusions. So, but I mean, I think fundamental point here, I'm not aware of what level of immunity former presidents might have, but it's quite clear that we witnessed something extremely serious. There was a serious threat to the peaceful, orderly transition of power that is at the fundamental heart of every democracy. Whether it's America or anywhere else, that when a candidate has been defeated who held office has been defeated in election, that there is a peaceful and orderly transfer of the authority that comes with that position. That was seriously threatened for a time in the Capitol. And I think it's quite clear that Donald Trump did not play the role that an outgoing president should have played there. And I think it's in the public interest for people to find out exactly what role he did play, what instructions he did give, what steers he did give. And if subpoenaing members of his family is thought to be an appropriate way of doing that, then personally, I have absolutely no issue at all with going down that route, however unprecedented it is. I mean, it's not the subpoenaing of a member of a former president's family that is the outlier here or that is in any way shocking or new or novel. It is in the behaviour of the president, the former president himself, in impeding what should have been the orderly and constitutional and legal transfer of power. So, yeah, I think if it's thought that a subpoena is the appropriate route to take here, that's the route that should be taken. And if she stays quiet, I think that people will draw conclusions from that.
Yes, indeed, and that will feed into the GOP's discussions on who is to be the next candidate for 2024. We'll see that. Let's just move on to our final story tonight. And we hear good news today that the Dundee Repertory Theatre is to be A-listed. Historic Environment Scotland, HES, have announced today that the Dundee Rep Theatre has been granted A-listed status for special architectural significance. The theatre, built in 1982, has been listed due to its exceptional design quality as well as its contribution to civic life, society and culture in Scotland in the late 20th century. The decision follows a 6-week consultation launched in December to gather views from people with an interest in the building. Dara Parsons, head of designations at HES, said, "We are delighted to add the Dundee Repertory Theatre to a list of Scotland's most significant buildings. The building has long been recognised as an exceptional piece of architecture and an important cultural hub. Dundee Rep Theatre is a rare example of a modern, purpose-built theatre in Scotland, one of only 3 major Scottish theatres built during the post-war theatre building boom which swept across Britain from the 50s to the mid-80s. While largely dictated by the restrictions of the small site and the arrangement and geography of the layout combines the aspirations of new post-war theatres such as openness and accessibility with modern design principles. Associated with prominent actors and directors including David Tennant, Alan Cumming, Joanne Lumley and Robert Robertson, Dundee Rep is the only theatre in Scotland that is home to a permanent full-time company of actors." So Richard Thomson, Member of Parliament. We're going to end on that story tonight, so can I thank you for joining us on Scotland at 7. So I know you've been on the programme before, but it's the first time I've met you, so it's been a pleasure to hear your thoughts on tonight's news. Thank you for joining us.
Great pleasure.
Right. And yes, and I hope we'll see you again on the programme. So I'll just finish tonight by saying that once again, we are putting the programmes out always free to view, and we depend on your donations and your subscriptions to keep the show going. So if you look down below, that's our web address. And if you'd like to join us as one of our subscribers, please look at the website. And for starting at £5 a month, you could become one of the regular subscribers, and you're then going to be one of the team which keeps Scotland at 7 on the air. Like everybody else, we also have rising fuel bills to pay. We've got some pretty hefty bills to meet by the end of March. So with your help, we'll get those bills, we'll go over that barrier, and we'll keep on going, bringing independent news from Scotland for Scotland. So thanks for watching and thanks for being a subscriber. And so once again, then it's good night from me, and it's good night from Richard Thomson, the Member of Parliament. And we'll see you again, I hope, Richard. So to everyone, I'll be back tomorrow, and thank you for watching. Good night.